I noticed something in the way he smiled that first evening. Too wide, too practiced, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. I told myself I was being a suspicious old woman. I told myself my son deserved happiness. I almost let that smile cost me everything. My name is Margaret, and I am 63 years old. I raised my son Daniel alone after his father passed, and I did it on a nurse's salary, long overnight shifts, and a stubbornness that my late husband called my greatest gift and my worst habit depending on the day. When Gerald died 11 years ago, he left me 3 things: a paid-off house on Clover Hill Road, a life insurance policy I never touched, and the discipline never to let grief make me careless. I kept all 3. The house is a craftsman-style home, 4 bedrooms, a wide front porch, and a half-acre yard that I tend myself. Nothing flashy, but it sits in a neighborhood where values have tripled since we bought it in 1994, and anyone with a smartphone in 5 minutes could find out exactly what it's worth. The insurance money sits in a trust that my attorney structured carefully. Gerald wanted Daniel taken care of. Gerald also wanted me taken care of. Those were 2 separate documents, and I kept them separate on purpose. Daniel is 34. He works in civil engineering. Good job, steady income, the kind of man who reads the fine print on a lease and still calls me every Sunday. I am proud of him in ways I cannot always put into words. He is the best thing I ever did. Which is exactly why, when he called me 14 months ago and said, "Mom, I met someone and I think she might be it," I said what every mother should say. I said, "Tell me everything." Her name was Cassandra. He called her Cass. They had met at a work conference in Indianapolis, and apparently she had laughed at something he said during a panel discussion, and he had been done for ever since. She lived 40 minutes away, worked in pharmaceutical sales, drove a leased BMW, and had, in Daniel's words, the most organized apartment you've ever seen. He said it like it was a compliment. I filed it away as information. I met her 6 weeks later at a Sunday dinner I hosted. She brought a bottle of wine that was slightly too expensive to be casual and slightly too cheap to be impressive. The kind of choice that is calculated to appear effortless. She complimented my kitchen. She asked about the built-in bookshelves in the living room. She said, "Daniel told me you've lived here a long time. You must really love it." I said I did. She said, "Do you ever think about downsizing at some point?" I was 62 years old. I had just carried a 12-pound pot of soup from the stove to the table without assistance. I looked at her and I smiled and I said, "Not yet." Daniel did not notice the exchange. He was opening the wine. Over the following months, she became a regular presence. Sunday dinners, a few holidays, a birthday. She was always pleasant, always helpful, always asking the right questions in the slightly wrong way. How long had I worked at the hospital? Did I still have my nursing license active? Was I thinking about retirement soon? What did I do with my days now that I was only part-time? I answered the surface of each question and nothing beneath it. The first moment I paid real attention, the way a nurse pays attention, the way you notice a change in a patient's color before anyone else in the room has registered something is wrong, was an evening in October. Daniel had stepped outside to take a work call. Cassandra and I were alone in the kitchen, and she had her phone out and she said almost casually, "I was looking at properties in the Millbrook area. The values over here are incredible. This house alone must be." She paused, tilted her head, smiled that practiced smile. "Well, you must feel very secure." I set down my dish towel. I looked at her. I said, "I feel fine, thank you." She laughed breezily like it had been nothing and started talking about something else. But I stood at that sink for a moment after she turned away, and I felt the particular stillness that 40 years of nursing will teach you, the stillness that comes right before you understand what you're actually looking at. I did not say anything to Daniel that night. Instead, I started paying a different kind of attention. It was not dramatic. It did not happen all at once. It was the accumulation of small things, the way a diagnosis rarely comes from one symptom, but from the pattern of them together. She mentioned my house on 4 separate occasions over the next 2 months, always casually, always attached to some compliment, always with that slight pause where a question was implied but never quite asked. She asked Daniel in front of me whether I had a financial advisor. She asked me sweetly whether I had updated my will recently, just because things change, as we get older. She once picked up a piece of mail from my entryway table, not to read it, just to straighten the pile. And I noticed her eyes move across the return address before she set it back down. It was the letterhead of my attorney's office. I called my attorney the next morning. I did not tell Daniel any of this. I want to be honest about that. My son is a good man and he was in love, and I know what it looks like when someone is in love. The way the world softens at the edges, the way a person becomes the lens through which everything else is filtered. I did not want to become the suspicious mother who poisons her son's happiness on the basis of a few pointed questions and an uncomfortable feeling in my kitchen. I needed to know more. So I watched and I waited. And I kept Sunday dinners warm and my voice easy, and I told no one what I was thinking. 4 months after that October evening, Daniel called me on a Tuesday night and told me he was going to propose. He was happy in a way I had not heard in his voice, since he was a boy who had just learned something that astonished him. He told me about the ring. He told me about the plan. He asked if I was happy for him. I told him I loved him. I did not tell him what I had noticed. Not yet. Because I did not yet have anything concrete enough to say without sounding like a frightened old woman manufacturing a reason to keep her son close. So I held what I knew, and I kept watching. The engagement party was held at Cassandra's apartment. Our apartment, she had begun calling it, though Daniel still technically had his own place. She had planned everything herself. The guest list was her friends, her colleagues, 2 of Daniel's work friends. My name was on the invitation as a guest, not as the mother of the groom, which is a small thing, but it is the kind of small thing I notice. I arrived early. I told myself it was habit. Nurses arrive early. Cassandra met me at the door with a glass of champagne and that wide smile and a hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time to seem warm without being genuine. She showed me around the apartment. It was, as Daniel had said, immaculately organized. And as she walked me through the hallway toward the living room, I glanced toward the small desk in the corner of what she called Daniel's office space, a desk they had apparently set up for him since he'd been spending so much time there. On the desk, half open, was a manila folder. I did not stop walking. I did not change my expression, but I saw, in the second I passed, a document that had 3 words visible at the top: Power of Attorney. My name was on it. I kept walking. I took a sip of champagne. I found a seat near the window, and I smiled at people I was introduced to, and I chatted about the weather, and somewhere in my chest a door closed very quietly and very firmly, and behind it something I can only describe as clarity settled in. I excused myself to use the restroom. On the way back, I walked close enough to that desk to see what I needed to see. The document was a draft, printed, not signed. It named me as the principal. It named Cassandra as the agent. It cited age-related cognitive decline as the basis for the arrangement. I was 63 years old. I had a master's degree in nursing. I managed my own finances, drove myself everywhere, and had beaten my 34-year-old son at Scrabble the previous Christmas. I went back to the living room. I found Daniel by the kitchen doorway laughing with someone from his office. I touched his arm and I said quietly, "I need to speak with you. When you get a moment, privately." Something in my tone reached him. He looked at me, and I saw the moment his expression shifted. Not alarm, not yet, but the particular attention of a child who knows his mother's serious voice from her casual one. He said, "Now?" I said, "Whenever you can step away." 10 minutes later, we were on the small balcony, the party noise behind the glass door. It was February. We could see our breath. I told him everything, calmly, beginning with October, ending with the document on the desk. I did not editorialize. I did not cry. I simply told him what I had observed in sequence, the way I would present a clinical history to a physician. Daniel did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Let me see it." I said, "The folder is on the desk. I don't know if she's moved it." He went inside. I stayed on the balcony and watched the city lights and breathed the cold air and thought about Gerald, who would have known what to say at this moment. Who would have put his hand on my shoulder and said something steady and plain? Daniel came back 4 minutes later. His face had changed in a way I had not seen since the night his father died. Not grief, exactly, but the particular devastation of someone who has discovered that a thing they believe to be solid is not solid at all. He had the folder in his hand. He stood in the cold with me, reading. I let him read. I did not say anything. When he finished, he closed the folder. He looked out at the city. He said, "I had no idea." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "How long have you known something was wrong?" I said, "I suspected. I didn't know until tonight." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "She told me 2 weeks ago that she was worried about you, that you seemed confused sometimes, forgetful. She said maybe we should look into some resources." He stopped. I thought she was being caring. I looked at my son. I said, "That's called laying a foundation." He understood. He is a smart man. He put together what I was telling him, that Cassandra had been building a record, slowly, carefully, collecting moments or perhaps inventing them, establishing in Daniel's mind a narrative of his mother's decline that would make a power of attorney seem reasonable, even loving, when she eventually suggested it directly. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Tonight, nothing. This is your engagement party. I'm not going to walk in there and—" He said, "Mom?" I stopped. He said, "What do you want to do?" I looked at my son. This man I had raised, this person who had called me every Sunday for 11 years without being asked, who had sat beside me in a hospital room when his father was dying and held my hand and not said a word because he understood that sometimes silence is the most loving language. I said, "I want to protect myself, and I want you to know the truth." He said, "You have both." We went back inside. Daniel was quiet for the rest of the evening, but he is a man who has always known how to keep his face calm when his mind is working. Cassandra did not notice, or if she did, she attributed it to something else. She laughed and poured drinks and accepted congratulations and once caught my eye across the room and smiled that smile. I smiled back. The following week, Daniel asked her directly about the document. He told me later that she tried 3 different explanations in the space of 10 minutes. First, that it was for research, then that a friend had recommended it as something all families should have, then finally that she had only been trying to help, that she was worried about me, that he was misunderstanding her intentions. When he told her he had spoken with an attorney and the document contained errors that reflected knowledge of my specific assets that she should not have had, she stopped explaining and started crying. Daniel ended the engagement that evening. He called me afterward. He did not say much. He said, "It's done." He said, "I'm okay." He said, "I'll come for dinner Sunday." I said, "I'll make the soup." There's a thing that happens sometimes when a danger passes. Not relief, exactly, but something quieter. A recalibration. I sat in my kitchen that night after we hung up, in the house on Clover Hill Road that Gerald and I bought when Daniel was 3 years old, and I thought about all the Sunday dinners and all the years and all the small, careful choices that had accumulated into the life I was still, thank God, living on my own terms. I thought about the women who don't catch it in time, the ones who sign documents they don't fully understand because someone they trusted handed them a pen, the ones whose assets are moved, whose independence is quietly managed away, whose version of events is never the one that gets written down. I had been a nurse for 4 decades. I had seen enough of the world to know that predators do not always look like predators. Sometimes they bring expensive wine and ask about your bookshelves and smile until the smile becomes familiar enough that you stop questioning it. I did not stop questioning it. I want to say that plainly for anyone who is listening and who has a voice in their chest that is telling them something is wrong. That voice is not paranoia. That voice is not the suspicious bitterness of a lonely old woman. That voice is information. Pay attention to it. Write down what you notice. Call your attorney before you call your children, because your attorney will not try to protect you from the truth the way your children will. And hold your documents close, not because you distrust the people who love you, but because the people who love you will never ask to see them in the first place. Daniel came for dinner that Sunday. He was quiet in the way he gets when he is processing something, the way he has been since he was a boy who thought carefully before he spoke. We ate the soup. We talked about his work, about a project in the planning stages, about nothing important and everything that was. At one point, he put down his spoon and looked at me and said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it." I said, "You weren't supposed to see it. That was the whole point." He nodded. I said, "She was good." He said, "You were better." I thought about Gerald, who would have smiled at that, who would have said, "Of course she was. Have you met your mother?" I reached across the table and put my hand over my son's hand, and we sat like that for a moment in the kitchen of the house on Clover Hill Road. And outside the window, the neighborhood was quiet in the early evening, and everything that mattered was still exactly where it was supposed to be. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything.